Good day, everyone. I am going to discuss the first parts of the topic Early Filipino Student Activities in Spain. So, after the events of 1872, a sort of lull settled on Filipino nationalist activities in the Philippines and in Spain. Henceforth, the Filipino clergy would not take a leading part. Burgos had been executed, and the other Filipino priests who had been prominent in the controversy over the parishes returned from their exile apparently with little taste for further endangering their position. Moreover, Archbishop Meliton Martinez, who had sympathized with his clergy's desire to limit the role of the friars in the parishes, if not with their nationalism, resigned in 1874 and was succeeded the following year by a Dominican Archbishop, Pedro Payo. So, Gregorio Meliton Martinez was the 22nd Archbishop of Manila. During his time, the Cathedral Restoration Committee, or Junta, was modified, composed of the Cabildo under him. Though the Filipinos in Spain would often argue the case of the Filipino priest in the future, there was little sign of open activity on the part of the priests themselves until the outbreak of the revolution in 1896, though undoubtedly the resentments lived on and were eventually to culminate in the Aglipayan schism in the early years of the American regime. Towards 1880, the tiny trickle of students from the Philippines to the universities of the peninsula gradually turned into a steady flow. During that time, students who can afford studying abroad came from well-to-do families, mostly the Creoles and Mestizos. Creoles are those persons of mixed European and Black descent, especially in the Caribbean. It was natural that in the early years the Creoles should predominate since they were sons of peninsular fathers who still retained contacts with the mother country. They were soon followed, however, by young men of Chinese mestizo or Spanish mestizo stock and those of the wealthy native families. Both Creoles and Spanish mestizos identify themselves with the peninsular Spaniards. On the other hand, Chinese mestizos identify themselves with the native Filipinos or Indio. Yet, at the same time, all those born in the Philippines shared a certain feeling, not yet clearly defined, of being Filipinos, especially in this early period before racial divisions had come to the fore. The architect of the Restoration, Antonio Canovas del Castillo, was a great admirer of the British parliamentary system, and the last quarter of the 19th century witnessed his efforts to form a Spanish parliamentary system in that image. Here are some info about architect Antonio Canovas del Castillo. So, Antonio Canovas del Castillo is a Spanish historian whose political activity brought about the restoration of Spain's Bourbon dynasty. On the accession of Alfonso XII to the throne in 1875, largely the work of Canovas, the latter created around himself the Partido Liberal Conservador, more commonly known as the Conservatives, standing for a constitutional monarchy under the Alfonsist branch of the Bourbons. Though a conservative group as a whole was not of the extreme right, and though it generally supported the church, it was not explicitly so committed. The new Constitution of 1876, which embodied the program of Canovas, aroused bitter protest from the Vatican and the Spanish bishops, for though it proclaimed Catholicism as the religion of the Spanish nation, unlike the Constitution of 1869, it nevertheless tolerated the private practice of other religions. On the left of Canovas' party, and with his encouragement, arose the party headed by Praxedes Mateo Sagasta, known as the Constitutionalist or Liberal Party, rallying those monarchists who still held to the Constitution of 1869 but supported Alfonso XII. Here are some info regarding Praxedes Mateo Sagasta. He is known as the Constitutionalist or Liberal Party. So, his political career started in 1848 while he was at the Engineering School of Madrid. He also had his part in the government during the turbulent years of revolution in Spain. And during the War of 1898, Sagasta was the Prime Minister of Spain. After the addition by 1878 of splinter groups from both right and left, the party became known as the Fusionist Party. These two dynastic parties, though without a doctrinal basis, were largely united on rather opportunistic grounds and were subject to frequent schisms and realignments, particularly the Fusionists. More doctrinaire were the parties of right and left, which refused to recognize the Alfonsist monarchy. So, Emilio Castelar was the one who led the Republicanos Históricos or Posibilistas by legal means. The Federalistas under Francisco I. Margal held aloof as he did the advocates of a unitary republic under a third former president Nicolas Salmeron, and Manuel Ruiz Zorrilla declared for the restoration of the republic by means of revolution. The two parties which Canovas had called into existence in imitation of the British parliamentary system were to share power between them in orderly fashion till the end of the century. But the two leaders permitted the entire system to be vitiated through managed elections. In the next 22 years, till the assassination of Canovas by an anarchist in 1897, the two parties alternated in power 11 times. As more serious crises came to be resolved, each would yield power to the other, and the successor government would then proceed to manage an election in which a respectable minority of opposition candidates would be elected, with a scattering of outstanding Republicans and Carlists to give verisimilitude to the Cortes. Though the heterogeneous composition of both parties and the continual shift of individuals and blocs from one to the other prevented the system from degenerating into a series of rubber stamp parliaments, the atmosphere of corruption that had characterized so much of 19th century Spanish political life was perpetuated. The attendant spoils system was ruinous both to minimal administrative efficiency and to government solvency. Not only were there 11 changes of party during this period, but both Canovas and Sagasta, within a single term of office, often reorganized their cabinet 2 or 3 times. Each change of party, and to a slightly lesser extent each reorganization of cabinet, was accompanied by a wholesale turnover in government employees down to the lowest echelons, as politicians newly installed provided for their followers. As a rule, capacity for the office in question was the least of considerations, and even when capable men were selected, the brevity of their tenure before the next turnover precluded substantial achievements, to say nothing of basic structural reforms, either in Spain or in the colonies. The position of the Church in Spain, though it was legally privileged and actually a potent political force in many ways, was somewhat ambiguous. Canovas' realistic compromise between the demands of advocates of separation of church and state as proclaimed in the Constitution of 1869 and those of traditionalist Catholics who insisted on complete intolerance had been accepted by the Holy See. Ecclesiastical nominations were made by the government, which also paid ecclesiastical salaries as indemnity for confiscated church lands. At the beginning of the Restoration, professors accused of heterodoxy in their teaching were removed from the universities, but a succeeding liberal government restored them, and they were henceforth unmolested in spite of periodic protest from members of the hierarchy. Similarly, freedom of the press and of assembly and other rights introduced under Sagasta's governments were left untouched by later Canovas regimes, though in practice neither party always observed them completely. The intransigence of the larger part of the clergy and the sizable group of the more ardent Catholics kept them from having any constructive influence on Spanish life and led them to pretensions which only increased the anti-clericalism of other sectors of Spanish society. The state of education in the 1880s, though an improvement on that prevailing during the earlier part of the century, was nonetheless deplorable. The larger part of the population was illiterate, and the primary and secondary schools provided by the state were poor both in numbers and in quality. The universities and the intellectual life in general were far behind those of the rest of Europe. The efforts of the Church to exclude heterodox teachings from the universities in 1867 to 1868 and in 1875, relying on the Concordat, through momentarily successful, were soon neutralized, and the heterodoxy of the Spanish university was, if anything, accentuated. Moreover, in spite of a few scholars of note, quite a number of the professors and many of the students were deeply involved in politics to the detriment of serious work. It was only towards the end of the century that progress would begin to be made in renewing Spain's university life. This was the Spain that greeted the growing number of Filipino students arriving in the 1880s and 1890s. So that's the end of my report, and the continuation of the topic will be discussed by the next report.